The night I ended my mother-in-law's 3-year campaign against my marriage, I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for an apology. I didn't argue with a single word she tried to say. I simply opened my phone, pressed play on a recording, and watched every lie she had ever told collapse in front of everyone she loved. But before I tell you how that evening ended, you need to understand what she spent 3 years trying to take from me. And exactly how long she believed she was going to get away with it, because the most dangerous thing about a woman like Margaret isn't what she does out in the open, everything she does when no one is watching. I know. Because I watched her do it for 11 months before I was finally ready to stop her. Why husband James was the kind of man who called his mother every single day, not out of obligation. Out of genuine devotion. He called her on his lunch break, on the drive home, sometimes just to share something funny that had happened at work. It was one of the things I loved about him when we first met. A man who loved his mother like that, I thought, was a man who understood loyalty. His mother, Margaret, welcomed me with open arms from the very beginning. She hugged me at every family gathering. She complimented my cooking. She told anyone who would listen how lucky James was to have found me. At our engagement dinner, she stood up and gave a speech that made 3 of his aunts cry. I prayed for a woman who would love my son the way he deserved, she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. And God sent me Sarah. I believed every word, but there were 2 moments in that first year that I would later remember very differently. The first happened at a family birthday party, 3 months after the wedding. Margaret was telling a story about a vacation James and I had taken the previous summer. But in her version, I had complained through most of the trip and refused to visit his relatives on the drive home. No. None of that had happened. When I gently corrected her, she patted my arm and said warmly, "Oh darling, you must have misremembered." Everyone laughed and the conversation moved on. I told myself it was a mistake. The second moment came 6 months later. James mentioned, casually, that his mother had called to check on him after our first real argument, a small disagreement about finances that we had resolved before dinner. I hadn't told anyone about that argument. James hadn't either, but Margaret had known. I told myself I was imagining things. I wasn't. Started slowly. The way these things always do. 18 months into our marriage, James began to change. Not dramatically. Not in any way I could point to and name. Just small, quiet shifts. A longer pause before answering a question. A comment here and there that didn't quite sound like him. One evening he came home and asked if I was happy in the marriage. I was surprised. We had just had a wonderful weekend. I told him I was. He nodded, but something in his expression didn't fully settle. My mom mentioned you've seemed unhappy lately, he said quietly. That you told her things have been difficult. I stared at him. I had never said anything like that to his mother. I kept our marriage private. I thought that was the respectful thing to do, but James believed her. Why wouldn't he? She was his mother. She had no reason to lie. 3 weeks later, he mentioned an argument I had supposedly started with his younger sister at a family gathering. An argument I had absolutely no memory of, because it had never happened. When I told him that, he looked uncertain. She seemed really upset about it, he said. I started writing things down. Dates. What he said his mother had told him. What had actually happened. By the 3rd month, I had 6 entries in my notes. Not one of them was true. Was living inside a story Margaret had written about me. A version of me that was cold, difficult, and quietly making everyone around her uncomfortable. And I had no way to fight it, because how do you disprove something you never said? Have you ever had someone try to rewrite who you were to the people you love? If you have, you already know exactly how that feels. Drop a comment below if this is something you've been through. Because at that point in my story, I was beginning to feel very alone. The proof came by accident. The way it usually does. I was visiting the family home one afternoon when my phone died. I asked Margaret if I could borrow hers to call James. She handed it over without hesitation, was halfway through dialing when a message preview appeared at the top of the screen. James's name. 3 words visible before it locked. She said again that. I handed the phone back, smiled, and excused myself to find a charger, but I didn't forget those 3 words. That night, I made a decision. I would run a test. Small. Careful. Specific. I told Margaret something that had never happened. I mentioned, quietly, that James and I had been disagreeing about whether to move to a larger apartment, and that I had been pushing for it for months against his wishes. James and I had never once discussed moving. Not a single conversation. 4 days later, he came home and mentioned gently that he thought our apartment was perfectly fine for now, and he didn't want me to feel any pressure about it. Asked him where that had come from. He paused. Mom mentioned you'd been bringing it up. I had to sit down. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was evidence. Planted 2 more false stories over the following 2 weeks. Both came back through James within days. Margaret was systematically feeding him a fabricated image of his own wife. Collecting real details, then twisting them. Manufacturing problems that didn't exist. That was the moment I stopped doubting myself, I told myself later. And started documenting everything. Over the next 3 months, I built a file. The first thing I documented was the messaging campaign itself. Every false story that returned to me through James, I recorded. Date. What he reported. What had actually happened. The list grew to 14 entries. 14 separate fabrications. Each one small enough to dismiss individually. All of them building the same portrait of a difficult, unhappy wife. The second discovery was larger. In the spring, I received a call from a former colleague about a position at a growing marketing firm. It was exactly the opportunity one had been hoping for. I mentioned it at Sunday dinner because I was excited. Margaret asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely pleased for me. 2 weeks later, James sat me down. He had been thinking, he said. He was worried I was prioritizing my career over our home. He talked about balance. About priorities. About what we were building together. They were Margaret's phrases. I had heard every one of them in her voice before I ever heard them in his, and never received a second call from that firm. The third discovery came from an unexpected direction. James had an aunt, his father's sister, a quiet woman named Carol who had always been kept at the edges of family gatherings. I had never understood why, until the afternoon I found myself alone with her at a cousin's wedding. Asked her carefully if she had ever seen anything like what I was experiencing. Carol set down her glass. She looked at me for a long moment. There was a woman before you, she said. They were together for nearly 2 years. Margaret didn't approve. She was gone within a year of the engagement. I asked how. Carol shook her head slowly. The same way she does everything. Quietly. Patiently. Until he believed it was his own idea. I drove home that evening and sat in the car for 20 minutes before going inside. Wasn't the first. The fourth piece was the recording. The following Sunday, I arrived at James's parents' house early and excused myself to help in the kitchen. I left my phone on the counter, recording, and took my time preparing the salad. In the living room, Margaret spoke to James alone for 11 minutes while I stood at the kitchen window. Later listened to every second of those 11 minutes. She told him I had been complaining about his family to my relatives. That I had said the Sunday dinners were a burden. That I had told my own mother I wasn't sure I had married the right person. Not one word of it was true. Sat in that kitchen listening through the wall to my mother-in-law calmly dismantle my marriage sentence by sentence, and I thought, I have everything I need. But I still didn't move. Because what I wanted wasn't just for James to believe me. I needed him to truly see who his mother was. And for that, I needed one more thing. I needed the right moment. Margaret hosted a large family dinner every second month. Extended family, James's siblings, his parents' closest friends. She planned them carefully and cared deeply about how they went. The next one was 3 weeks away. 3 days before that dinner, I sat James down at our kitchen table. I need to show you something, I said. And I need you to hear all of it before you say a single word. He looked at me carefully. Then he nodded. I opened my phone and walked him through every entry in my notes. The timeline. The false stories, the exact dates, and the precise words he had used when he repeated them back to me. I showed him the gap between what Margaret had told him and what had actually occurred, entry by entry, until it was impossible to read it as coincidence. Then I played the recording. The kitchen was silent for a long time. James stared at the table. Then he said quietly, "The job opportunity. The one in the spring." "Yes," I said. He was quiet again. "Then, she told me about the woman before you. Claire. She said Claire had made terrible comments about our family. That she was glad when it ended." He looked up slowly. I watched him put 3 years together in a single evening. 14 fabricated stories, 1 destroyed career opportunity, 1 ended relationship before mine. All of it built from the same patient, invisible architecture. "I'm not doing this to punish her," I told him. "I'm doing this because if we don't address it now, it will never stop." James was silent for a long time. Then he reached across the table and took my hand. "We'll go to the dinner," he said. Together. The dinner was on a Saturday evening. Margaret had set the table beautifully, the way she always did. The good china. Candles. Flowers from the garden. James's brother and his wife were there. His sister and her husband. His father, Robert. 3 of his parents' closest friends. Margaret hugged me at the door. She asked if I had brought my salad. I said I had. He sat down and everything was warm and ordinary for exactly 45 minutes. Then there was a natural pause in the conversation. I set down my glass. Before dessert, I said calmly, "I'd like to address something. Because I believe there has been some misunderstanding about who I am and what I've been saying. And I think everyone at this table deserves to know the truth." The room stilled. Margaret looked at me with a small, composed smile. The smile of a woman who has been in this position before and won. I didn't look at her. I opened my notes and began. I told them about the false stories. I read several aloud, word for word, with the dates they had been reported back to me by James. I explained the false story test, the apartment disagreement that had never happened, and how it had returned to me through her son within 4 days. Then I told them about the job opportunity in the spring. And what Carol had shared about the woman before me. The room was no longer warm. It was completely still. Margaret's voice was steady when she spoke. I was only trying to protect my son. Everything I said came from concern. I looked at her for the first time since I had started speaking. "I have one more thing," I said quietly. I pressed play. 11 minutes of her own voice filled the room, her words. Her tone. Describing things I had never said or done, with the calm certainty of a woman who had never expected to be recorded. James's sister put her hand over her mouth. His father set down his fork and did not pick it up again. 2 of the friends exchanged a long look. When the recording ended, no one spoke. James looked at his mother across the table. "Did you do the same thing to Claire?" he asked. Quietly. Without anger, she didn't answer. She didn't have to. James's father stood slowly, looked at his wife for a moment, then walked around the table to stand beside his son. That was the only moment in the entire evening when I felt something close to emotion, turned to Margaret and said the last thing I would ever need to say to her on this subject. "I don't need an apology from you. I don't need anything from you at all. I only need you to understand that everything you built against me, every story, every whisper, every carefully placed doubt, I have been taking it apart for 11 months. And tonight, it's done." James stood. He offered me his hand. We left together. He drove home in silence for several minutes. The city passed quietly outside the windows. Then James said, "I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." I looked at him. "You see it now." That was enough. That was 14 months ago. James's relationship with his mother is different now. Not ended. Different. There are boundaries that didn't exist before. Conversations that have been had. Trust that is being rebuilt carefully and honestly. Our marriage is stronger than it has ever been. Margaret and I are civil. Nothing more. I don't need anything more than that. What I learned from those 3 years is this. the people who work against you quietly are counting on one thing. They are counting on you to doubt yourself enough to stay silent. The moment you start documenting instead of doubting, the power shifts completely. And it never shifts back. She thought patience was her greatest weapon. She never once considered it might be mine as well. Now I want to hear from you. Was confronting her at the family dinner, in front of everyone, the right call? Or should this have stayed private? Between the three of them, there is no wrong answer. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If you have ever been the quietest person in the room while someone tried to rewrite your story, subscribe. Because every story on this channel belongs to the people who stayed patient, stayed smart, and got the last laugh.